Howdy, y'all. A few months ago, in one of my history classes, I read a passage from the Victorian-era author Eliza Lynn Linton. Linton is one of the more interesting figures of Victorian England, starting a writing career at 23, and soon becoming the first woman to be a paid journalist in England. Like many other such pioneers, Linton was a strong advocate of women's rights, with her second novel, published in 1848, passionately defending them. This is all well and good, of course, but the passage of hers I read was not from this novel. Rather, it was from her 1868 article, The Girl of the Period. By this point, Linton's politics had taken a notable turn right, with her separating from her husband the prior year due to the rift between his radicalism and her growing conservatism. Her politics come through clearly in The Girl of the Period, a tract which derides young women for their embrace of fashion and makeup, as well as their perceived loose morals, going on to claim that they are only a poor copy of the real thing, when compared to the girl of the past, who pleases and elevates her husband. I remind you that Linton and her husband had split from their unhappy marriage by this point. Linton would go on to pen similarly anti-feminist works for the rest of her career, attacking women's education, women's suffrage, and a law which prevented husbands from imprisoning their wives. Linton's story resonated with me because for over a year now, I've been racking my brain with the question of why so many women are drawn towards right-wing ideology, given that said ideology is openly hostile towards women's rights. Over the past century and change, the right have opposed suffrage, women in the workplace, the Equal Rights Amendment, reproductive rights, as well as just feminism in general. For most of my life, I've struggled to see what, if anything, the right offers women. But despite my confusion, a large number of women turn out every election to vote for the right-wing candidates, particularly white women, who have actually preferred the Republican candidate in every presidential election this century. What's more, women have been involved in every major right-wing political movement for over 100 years, being the driving force behind many conservative victories. What I'd like to do today is analyze these women, look at their contributions to right-wing movements from the Civil War to today, and use this to find out how right-wing women fit into a political movement that, on paper, doesn't appear to have a place for them. Act 1. A history of right-wing women. In order to understand why women are drawn to the right, it's crucial to understand what right-wing women's activism has looked like. We start our journey with a women's organization whose influence is still felt to this day. Part 1. Reconstruction and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. In the wake of the Civil War, America faced a major issue: how to go about reunifying the country while securing the rights of the newly emancipated Black population. This task was made all the more precarious by the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. While we'll never be able to fully know how Lincoln's version of Reconstruction would have gone, I feel fully confident in saying he could not have done a worse job than his replacement, Andrew Johnson. The Johnson administration took a very lax approach to Reconstruction, pardoning the vast majority of Confederates. He reversed General William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Order 15, which redistributed land taken from Southern planters to African Americans, with Johnson returning the land to its original white owners. This certainly didn't help with the issue that many emancipated African Americans had no assets with which to build wealth, ultimately leading them back to the fields in the exploitative sharecropping system. Johnson also fought the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which extended citizenship rights to include freedmen, vetoing it before Congress eventually passed it despite him. This act was essentially a precursor to the 14th Amendment, which Johnson would also oppose. His policy of preventing any actual positive change fostered the perfect breeding ground for the Ku Klux Klan and a spate of Jim Crow laws designed to maintain the systemic racial inferiority of the Black population. White violence and discriminatory voting laws would quickly suppress the initial wave of Black political power, keeping African Americans out of the House of Representatives for nearly 30 years, and out of the Senate for nearly 90. However, Bringing back the subjugation of African Americans wasn't the only concern of the former Confederate states. Shortly after the war ended, Kate Stone, the daughter of a Mississippi slaveholder, wrote that talk of defeat seemed like a reproach to their gallant dead. Many former Confederates did not want to accept the reality of losing a war they instigated. Instead of lying down and accepting defeat, they went on to memorialize the Confederacy. Or, as historian David Blight puts it, they converted their defeat into a triumphant remembrance. And this push to memorialize the Confederacy would be headed by women. Shortly after the war ended, ladies' memorials associations began the process of burying the Confederate dead, placing tens of thousands of people into newly created Confederate cemeteries. And by 1866, these memorial associations began to erect monuments, usually in the cemeteries, but many city centers and town squares would receive them as well. This would continue at a steady pace until the 1890s, where, a generation removed from the Civil War, there were many organizations of wealthy white Southern women doing the same work of memorializing the Confederate cause, but with an added emphasis on preserving Confederate culture for future generations. These disparate groups, all calling themselves the Daughters of the Confederacy, would join together, along with many ladies' memorial associations and women's auxiliaries to the United Confederate Veterans, into a national organization on September 10, 1894, forming the National Association of the Daughters of the Confederacy, before changing the name a year later to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. One of the primary goals of the UDC was spreading what is called the lost cause narrative. This is a myth propagated by losers, which posits that the reason the Southern states seceded from the Union and fought the Civil War was not due to a desire to preserve the institution of slavery, but rather because of states' rights. In the view of the UDC, secession was not an act of rebellion, and Confederate soldiers were not traitors. Rather, they were to be held up as American heroes, their cause just and noble, and their conviction true. This narrative did not originate with the UDC, of course. The Richmond Dispatch was writing as early as December 1865 that the South had fought due to a sense of rights under the Constitution. But the UDC would go on to be the most responsible for spreading the lost cause over the coming decades. Before we get into how they did that, I think we should take a moment to tackle the lost cause narrative. After all, if it was able to spawn such a massive movement, to the point where it's still being debated today, surely there must be some merit behind it, right? On March 21, 1861, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens would deliver a speech in which he said, "Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." I could point to countless other examples, but honestly, I think this section is funnier with just the one quote, because, they just say it outright. If the South had won the war, nobody would be deluding themselves into thinking it was over states' rights. The lost cause is, as the name suggests, the desperate rhetorical failings of a bunch of defeated losers. But it makes sense how the lost cause narrative appealed so heavily to organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy. It's right there in the name. These women were the daughters, the wives, the family of Confederate soldiers. Many of them lost loved ones in the war. They didn't want their family to be seen by the public and by history as traitors, fighting for a morally disgusting cause. Kate Stone, the woman I mentioned earlier, who was bemoaning the gallant Confederate dead, would later become a chapter leader for the UDC. For those who viewed the Confederate soldiers as heroes, this organization provided them with a method to make the rest of the country venerate them in the same way. Women were also central to the lost cause narrative, often being used to represent the cause the South had fought for. Winnie Davis, the daughter of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, was used as a symbol of purity and white womanhood, accompanying Davis on his post-war speaking tours. This status as the moral center of the Confederate cause is reflected in monuments dedicated to Confederate women. In the post-war period, women were once again turned into the symbol which would necessitate racist violence. Unlike the glory days, when white Southern women would be attended by their faithful slaves, the Reconstruction period was presented as one during which these women were fearful for their safety, due to the newly emancipated status of African Americans. Kate Stone wrote in 1867 of being deadly afraid of the black soldiers in her area. The idea of dangerous, freed black men is presented most famously in the 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation. In the film, Gus, a black soldier, aggressively pursues Flora, a white woman, with the proposition of marriage. This eventually drives Flora to jump off a cliff, and her death becomes one of the initial justifications for violence by the KKK. The lost cause narrative was extremely palatable to many ex-Confederates and their families, and so the UDC rapidly expanded its membership, growing from 20 local chapters after the first year to 138 by year 3. Membership would continue to skyrocket, with the organization reaching a membership of 30,000 after its first decade, before eventually peaking at 100,000 members at the end of World War I. This made it one of the largest women's groups of the era, with leaders attributing their massive growth to the will of God, because of course they thought they were divinely ordained. With their incredible size, the UDC was able to take on some massive projects. They continued the work of the Ladies' Memorial Associations at an increased rate. One half of all Confederate monuments were erected between 1903 and 1912, the peak of the UDC's monument building campaign. Nearly every local chapter of the UDC would lead fundraising efforts to build a Confederate memorial in their town. The UDC's national scope also enabled them to take on much larger regional-level monuments. Because of their reputation for success, other Confederate groups, such as the United Confederate Veterans and the Sons of Confederate Veterans, both men's organizations, would typically contribute little to projects the UDC was involved in. In the case of the Jefferson Davis Monument, the UCV passed off the project to the UDC, as they were concerned that they would not be able to raise the funds, but trusted the UDC could. The Daughters were also involved in other large monument projects, such as those in Arlington, Shiloh, and Stone Mountain, with Stone Mountain being one of the rare projects left unfinished by the UDC. The reason behind their high success rate with fundraising was in no small part due to their status. UDC members were typically wealthy white women with significant social standing. They used this leverage to host successful fundraising events, hosting dances, concerts, and cakewalks, or dancing contests, in which the winner would receive a cake. This is pretty Alanis Morissette style ironic, as the cakewalk was originated by enslaved African Americans, with the dance steps meant to be a mocking mimicry of white people's mannerisms. And 50 years later, it was being used by white people to raise money for racism statues. Beyond hosting events, the UDC would also lobby local and state governments to appropriate funds for monument building. They even sold their own merchandise, as well as endorsing products which they received royalties on. Every monument the Daughters built, regardless of size, was unveiled with massive fanfare. The UDC arranged parades, dances, speakers, and plenty of decorations. By making every monument into a public celebration, with the whole town involved, from Confederate veterans to school children, the Daughters were able to ingrain celebration of the Confederacy into public life in the South. The purpose of endlessly memorializing and celebrating the Confederate soldiers was to put them in the same discussions as other American heroes, in the process, laundering the Confederate cause into one intertwined with Americanism. The UDC was, in essence, attempting to subvert the supposed rule that history is written by the victors. Despite their military defeat, the Confederate cause became widely memorialized through this group's efforts. The other way the UDC attempted to rewrite the history of the Civil War was by, quite literally, rewriting the history of the Civil War. The daughters put a lot of effort into spreading their specific narrative of Confederate history, and that started from within the organization. Members, as well as Southern women at large, were encouraged to read the writings of notable Confederate figures such as Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, as well as those of pro-Confederate authors such as Mary L. Williamson. The idea was that if women were being given a lost cause style education, then they would transfer that knowledge onto their children, and the cycle would repeat. In a similar vein, the UDC offered scholarships to young people pursuing higher education, showing a particular interest in scholarships for women. While this may seem like a remarkably progressive and feminist stance for the time, they still saw women's education primarily as a vehicle for spreading lost cause rhetoric, as the women they granted scholarships to were generally training to become teachers. In the words of historian Karen Cox, whose book Dixie's Daughters informs much of this section, as these women became teachers, the daughters reasoned, thousands of the region's white youth were sure to learn reverence for the Confederate past, including the principle of states' rights and the value of white supremacy. The daughters recognized that children were the group most easy to indoctrinate with the lost cause narrative, and as such made sure to insert a reverence for Confederate values into as many schools as they could. Using their connections in their local communities, aided by the fact that many teachers were themselves members, the UDC lobbied for what they deemed an impartial history of the Confederacy, forming committees to look at textbooks used in schools and condemn those they deemed unfair to the Confederate cause, recommending other textbooks they agreed with instead. The daughters made sure that pro-Confederate books were available in schools and public libraries and recommended them to children, even going so far as to send books to schools as gifts, including schools for Black students. I mean, can you imagine the kindness? Here, have this book about how the dudes who fought to keep you in bondage were the real heroes. No, take it. I insist. The UDC furthered its commitment to promoting dumbass pro-Confederate education through hosting essay contests, where students would be tasked to write essays on topics such as the meaning of states' rights, if rebellion was ever justifiable, and the institution of slavery, with the winner, whose essay best exemplified the lost cause view, typically being awarded some conservative book, furthering their miseducation. There was one notable exception to this rule, as in 1907, to celebrate the centennial of Robert E. Lee's birth, the UDC sponsored an essay contest, but made the mistake of assembling a panel of judges who were all respected academics. The judges wound up awarding the prize to an essay by Christine Boyson, which said that Lee was a traitor and that the Confederate South was intellectually dead. In the aftermath of the contest, the UDC would suspect that many of its own members didn't even read the essay, which sounds about right for how much the pro-Confederacy side was typically willing to engage with any conflicting, more historically accurate viewpoints. It is perhaps in part because of this mistake that the daughters went to such great lengths to ensure Southern children learned things their way. In 1917, the group endorsed the Children of the Confederacy as its official auxiliary. The UDC had already been organizing CFC groups for a while on the local level, but with this national endorsement came an uptick in their activity. CFC groups, led by a chapter leader from the UDC, were essentially another layer of pro-Confederate education for children. These groups held special importance to the UDC, however, as many believed that getting kids involved in organization work from a young age would lead to them joining the UDC when they became adults, sustaining the organization through the generations. The CFC encapsulates a wider issue with the UDC's platform. You see, it wasn't satisfactory for them to merely have children learn a false account of Confederate history. These children also had to greatly admire the Confederacy, its generals, and its principles. To this end, the UDC held public celebrations of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis's birthdays, and worked to have portraits of Lee and Davis hung up in every school, not just in the South, but in the North as well, where the UDC was also active, if not quite as dominant. The act of hanging up portraits was meant to convey to students that these figures were to be respected, because people only really hang up portraits of those they like. That's why the Reagan White House had a portrait of Andrew Jackson, why the Biden White House has a portrait of FDR, and why the Doki Doki Discourse bedroom has a portrait of Hatsune Miku. Ultimately, what led the UDC to fall out of national prominence wasn't some scandal, internal strife, public backlash, any of that. It was that they were just so successful. They scaled back the monument building project following World War I, not from lack of funds, but because they had almost finished building all the monuments they initially wanted to. The education initiative was also a resounding success. To quote Cox, by the 1920s, most Southern states had adopted pro-Confederate textbooks. Public schools created curricula that included the study of the Confederacy. Students were released from classes to attend Confederate Memorial Day ceremonies, and their classrooms often included a portrait of Robert E. Lee next to that of George Washington. As late as the 1970s, neither textbooks nor curricula veered far from lost cause interpretations, especially in the Deep South. With their work largely competed, the UDC was free to fade into the background of public life. They had successfully rewritten the history of the Civil War, educating tens of millions of children over several decades with their false narrative, to the point that as late as 2011, 117 years after the UDC's founding, most Americans still put the blame on states' rights as the main cause of the Civil War, including a large portion of Black Americans. So, I guess the send a racist book to a black school gambit paid off in the end. It wasn't until 2023, with over a century and two massive Black civil rights movements between us and the Civil War, that a majority of polled Americans could point to slavery as the primary cause. This education, which failed generations of young minds, and the monuments which continue to pollute our public spaces, is the legacy of the UDC. Why was the North, the public, and the federal government willing to let the lost cause become the dominant narrative of the Civil War? Well, one obvious conclusion would be the palatability of racist narratives among much of white America. But I don't think that fully encompasses it. You see, following the Civil War, there was a desire among many from the North to forgive and reintegrate the South into the Union as quickly and with as little conflict as possible. That was the reasoning behind Andrew Johnson's lax approach to Reconstruction. It was why newspapers at the time called to quickly forgive the South. It was why reconciliation dominated the national narrative throughout the 1890s. It was why the North ultimately gave up on Reconstruction and allowed Jim Crow laws to sweep across the South. And it was why, in 1913, at the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg, Virginia Governor William Hodges Mann proudly declared, "We are not here to discuss what caused the War of 1861 to 65. He wouldn't even say Civil War. To borrow the thesis of David Blight's Race and Reunion, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the North sacrificed racial advancement for African Americans in the hopes of achieving a clean reunion between the North and South. With a history of giving in to Southern desires for fear of starting another bloody conflict, it makes it all too predictable that the North would relent, allowing the UDC to turn the lost cause into the official narrative of the war for much of the nation. Today, the UDC continues to operate. Their current membership sits at around 20,000. If you go to their website, you're greeted by a statement from their current President General, Ginny Wadowski. In the statement, she addresses the ongoing debate concerning Confederate monuments erected by the UDC. She denounces the fact that certain hate groups have taken the Confederate flag and other symbols as their own, before denouncing any group that promotes racial divisiveness or white supremacy, and pleading that the monuments should remain as part of our shared American history. This statement reads to me as a blatant refusal by the UDC to actually engage with the history of their own organization. What the fuck do they mean by certain hate groups taking Confederate symbols as their own? These people are employing Confederate symbols in the same way the UDC did in their heyday. The UDC was an organization which saw the KKK as redeemers of America, whose leaders argued the real victims of slavery were the slave owners, and who reshaped the Southern public square and Southern education in a glorious ode to their own white supremacy, modeled on the white supremacy of their revered Confederate greats. If, as Wadowski bemoans, some people find anything connected with the Confederacy to be offensive, then that is in large part the direct result of your own organization. This statement is just laughably absent of any self-awareness. You do not get to give your group a socially conscious rebranding when the nation is still reeling from the after effects of all the racist shit y'all did, and while actively defending the continued existence of said racist shit. The only historical relevance these monuments hold is as evidence to the extent of white supremacist organizing at the turn of the century. But by the 1920s, there was a shift in women's political organizing. The success of the suffrage movement, with the passage of the 19th Amendment, opened the doors for a whole new world of women's activism. And as the suffrage organizations gave way to new groups ready to meet the political moment, one would rise to dominate women's organizing. Just maybe not the one you'd hope for. Part 2. The WKKK. The initial iteration of the Klan was short-lived. While white supremacist violence was a constant throughout the Reconstruction era, and the entirety of US history, the actual organization had dissolved for the most part by the early 1870s. However, by the early 20th century, public sentiment had grown to become much more favorable of the Klan. As mentioned in the last section, the UDC made sure that school children would know to view the Klansmen as noble redeemers of the American dream. And in 1915, the nation would become enraptured in two massive media events. Well, I guess three if you count the war in Europe, but the US wouldn't enter World War I until 1917, and that's not really relevant for us, so we're gonna go with two. The first was The Birth of a Nation, the previously mentioned film about the tragic defeat of the Confederacy and the rise of the KKK to protect white women and the rule of law from corruption by evil black people. This blatantly ahistorical account of events was, at the time, the most successful film ever made. Practically everyone saw it, with one historian claiming that by 1946, the film had been seen by about 200 million Americans. At the time of the film's release, the US population was only about 100 million, so it's safe to say that the film would have had a massive reach within the general population, and the heroes of the film, being Klansmen, would have gone a long way towards convincing the public that the Klan was cool. Later that year, the lynching of a Jewish man named Leo Frank became national news. Frank had been convicted of the murder of a 13-year-old white girl at a trial in which there was a clear degree of anti-Semitism among the public and press coverage. Following several failed appeals, Frank was eventually granted a commutation, reducing his penalty from death to life in prison. This led to riots, as well as a protest song from Fiddlin' John Carson. Shortly into his prison sentence, Frank was lynched by a group of 25 people, calling themselves the Knights of Mary Fagin, a clear spiritual successor of the Klan. These events would lead one William Joseph Simmons to organize a new Ku Klux Klan, inviting real men to join and appointing himself the Imperial Wizard. Under Simmons' leadership, the new Klan would see little success, growing to only a few hundred members after 5 years. Failing to grow a white supremacy group in the 1910s US is an indication of just insane incompetence as an organizer. Because the problem definitely wasn't that there weren't enough racists. In 1920 though, the Klan would take off. Simmons received an offer from Elizabeth Tyler and Edward Young Clark, who, sensing an opportunity for great profit, told Simmons that they would help him grow the organization in exchange for 80% of the revenue from new members. Under their influence, the Klan would change its messaging, expanding their bigotry beyond just Black people to include Jewish people, Catholics, immigrants, and the general moral degeneration of America. Helping this new narrative was Henry Ford, the owner of Ford Motor Company, and the guy who made my great-grandpa sell his bar. Now, the only thing Ford hated more than alcohol, labor unions, and his immigrant employees was Jewish people. Ford had a whole side business of spreading anti-Semitic conspiracies. He widely distributed the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a text which claims to be the words of Jewish people and details their plans to take over the world. He also published a series of anti-Semitic essays in his newspaper, The Dearborn Independent, which would eventually be collected into a set of books titled The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. The influence this had was naturally massive. Ford was an insanely prominent, wealthy businessman, dedicating his time towards stoking hate towards a minority group. It'd be like if today, someone like Elon Musk was dedicating his massive influence and resources towards promoting transphobia or some other hypothetical situation. But with this, the KKK of the 1920s had a powerful new narrative. In recent public memory, there was a group of knights who supposedly delivered justice unto a Jewish criminal, as well as a film in which the Klan rises to save America from the threat of Black people. Here was a new threat, Jewish people, who, according to Ford, were steadily approaching global domination. Rising in turn, however, was the brand new Ku Klux Klan, with Tyler and Clark claiming they would now also attack Jewish people, as well as the other groups that white Protestants hated. If you were a racist, which much of the population was, this would present a very appealing narrative. It's, quite literally, your movie idols coming to life to save you. With this, the Klan grew rapidly, up to a purported 850,000 members by the summer of 1921, making Simmons, Tyler, and Clark a whole lot of money. Of course, once the organization grew to such a large scale, there were many high-ranking members who did not want Simmons as leader, whether due to his purchases of an expensive house and cars, his reputation for being not all there mentally, or his general incompetence at running an organization. Whatever the reasoning, Tyler, Clark, and some of the regional leaders would oust Simmons, convincing him to accept a new role as emperor, which removed all his actual power before buying out his stake in the Klan. In his place, Texan Hiram Evans became imperial wizard, fired Tyler and Clark for their troubles, and led the Klan through nearly 2 decades. The KKK continued to massive success, but remained a fraternal organization. Elizabeth Tyler is noteworthy for being one of the driving factors behind the Second Klan's success, with a 1921 congressional investigation concluding that she exercised the most power within the organization. But the rank-and-file members, as well as the rest of the leaders, were all male. White women were central to the rhetoric of the Klan. They were the ones the KKK supposedly existed to protect. They were the ones who had just gained increased political power with the right to vote. But these women were viewed as insufficient to become members, despite the fact that it was a woman who made the Klan what it was at the time. This bred resentment among many women who shared the Klan's ideology, with letters submitted to the Klan newspaper, The Fiery Cross, claiming to be women upset with their exclusion from Klan activities. Women also protested their exclusion by forming unofficial Klan groups, often with the backing of prominent Klan figures. There was the Ladies of the Invisible Eye, which Elizabeth Tyler was involved in, the Camellia, organized by founder William Simmons in an attempt to regain some power, the Queens of the Golden Mask, organized by D.C. Stevenson, owner of the Fiery Cross, the Ladies of the Invisible Empire, and the White American Protestants, or WAP. Due to their anti-Semitic beliefs, I'm going to go ahead and assume that this is Ben Shapiro's second least favorite type of WAP, The Klan proper feared that if these organizations were able to gain too much power, it would jeopardize their ability to create an official women's Klan. By the 1922 national meeting, or as they called it, Imperial Convocation, because they named everything as if they're writing some shitty medieval fanfic, the KKK's leaders had decided that they needed a women's Klan. There are many factors that informed this decision. As mentioned, the threat of competing organizations meant it was quickly becoming a hindrance not to have a women's auxiliary. Klansmen also saw much political potential in women. In their view, white Protestant women had naturally good political instincts due to their role as wives and mothers, but they lacked the political training to fully utilize those instincts. With the help of Klansmen, women could be trained to uphold the standards of Klan politics for generations to come. In a more cynical view, the Klan saw a massive new voting bloc, and recognized that appealing to it would help with its goals. I'm sure the revenue from new members also held quite a bit of sway. In June 1923, the Women of the Ku Klux Klan was established. It would quickly become the preeminent Klanswomen organization following a legal battle which dissolved all competing organizations. The WKKK would quickly rise to prominence, gaining 250,000 recruits within its first 4 months. And while there's no great sources on their peak membership, estimates for the Klan as a whole range from 3 to 5 million members. And the WKKK were a significant part of that figure. This made the WKKK one of the largest women's groups of the time. Now, how exactly was the Women's Klan able to attract so many members? Well, the KKK had always held itself up as a protector of women. But in this new incarnation, they extended that to frame themselves as the ultimate protectors of women's rights as well, claiming that with the power of the WKKK, they could protect women's suffrage and expand their rights into other realms. And it's worth noting that while the claims of protecting women had always been little more than an excuse for enacting violence upon the groups targeted by the Klan, the Second Klan also claimed that they would protect women from immoral actions committed by white Protestant men. This ultimately amounted to little more than a few incidents of neglectful husbands being threatened or attacked by the Klan. However, even if it wasn't that well enforced, it's easy to see how many women, who would have primarily experienced violence and immoral behavior from their white Protestant husbands, would find the claims of Klan protection appealing. Other forms of women's organizing were often a gateway towards WKKK membership. Prohibition groups, in an appeal to their white Protestant base, often connected the supposed evils of alcohol with Catholics and immigrants. The Anti-Saloon League even had direct Klan ties. With the passage of the 18th Amendment, it's easy to see why many prohibitionist women would have joined the WKKK in their continued fight against perceived immorality. Even some progressive women's activists joined the group, attracted by the Klan's dog whistle language of fighting for the rights of the common man and woman. Of course, even more women joined because they shared the white supremacist values of the Klan. For the ultimate example of the WKKK's recruitment efforts, we have Indiana. The KKK of the 1920s was able to become a much more national organization than something like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, because rather than focusing on the Confederacy, which was a very southern institution, the KKK's ideology centered around hatred of the groups they deemed immoral. Racism is popular nationwide. In Indiana, which was 97% white in 1920, there was a history of racist violence and politics long before the Klan arrived. Thus, when they did, the WKKK was able to enroll nearly a third of eligible women in the state. Now that we've established that many women joined the Klan, what exactly did Klanswomen do? As an auxiliary of the Klan, the WKKK was very similar in terms of structure, with local chapters feeding into state organizations, organized on the national level by their term here, excellent commander. There were several more layers of hierarchy within all of this, all having really dumb K names like Kleegrep, Clocard, Claby, and Clud. The Klan regularly held rituals meant to deepen members' loyalty, as well as further convince them of the danger of Black people, Jewish people, Catholics, and immigrants. It was necessary to deepen members' political convictions because the main form Klan activism took was a political and moral crusade. Klanswomen went on lecturing tours, which, among other things, spread claims of rampant abuse within the Catholic Church. I know what you're thinking, and no, the Klan wasn't early to the actual rampant abuse within the church. They just made up claims that priests, branded the nuns with crosses. You do not have to hand it to them. Klanswomen wrote books and periodicals, praising the Klan and decrying the immorality of its opponents. And through their personal connections, Klanswomen disseminated moral panic at the threat posed to women by Jewish, Catholic, and Black people. Klan rumor mills spread propaganda that, while almost never accurate, was firmly believed by those who heard it. Many of these rumors are detailed in Kathleen M. Blee's Women of the Klan, which informs the bulk of this section. And there's one that's so good, I need to share the quote. So, while being interviewed, one witness to a Klan rumor said, "Some Klan leader said that the Pope was coming to take over the country, and he said he might be on the next train that went through North Manchester. So, about 1,000 people went out to the train station and stopped the train. It only has one passenger train and one passenger on it. They took him off, and he finally convinced them that he wasn't the Pope. He was a carpet salesman. And so they put him on the next train, and he went on to Chicago." They thought the Pope was just taking a train alone through Indiana to take over America. The KKK would exercise considerable influence during the height of its power, counting over a dozen congressmen as well as 2 Supreme Court justices among its confirmed members, and claiming that most governors, congressmen, and President Harding were in the Klan, although this was an exaggeration to make them seem more powerful. Even if the number of actual Klan politicians remained a minority, the group was able to ensure that the rest of the politicians would be sympathetic to the Klan. Local chapters would vet candidates for political office and pick out ones who shared their positions. Klanswomen would then all vote the Klan ticket, canvass for their chosen candidates, register people to vote, and help them to the polls on election day. They would seek out women who hadn't voted, and then drive them to the polls, while other Klanswomen stayed behind and babysat their children. The power of the Klan to drive voter turnout meant that not only did candidates they disliked have no shot to win, but also that the other candidates were going out of their way to adjust their positions in order to win the Klan's endorsement. Klanswomen were also able to exercise their power more directly through boycotts, identifying Klan-backed businesses to support and Jewish and Catholic businesses to avoid, driving many to shut down. The most well-known Klan activities today are intimidation and violence. This was primarily done by Klansmen, although there are recorded instances of WKKK violence. And we know that violence was an essential component of the WKKK's identity. In response to this Klan violence, there were attempts to pass anti-Klan laws. The Klan's political power and intimidation tactics helped to keep these from passing, but in addition, the WKKK engaged in charity work as a way to launder the Klan's reputation. The actual charity work itself wasn't that important. The Klan did collect donations for the needy, but these donations were typically given to other Klan members. When donations went outside of the group, they were often pitiably small, especially in relation to the amount of press they generated. Klanswomen would do a single charitable act, such as giving a basket of clothes to one child, or entertaining hospital patients for a few hours, and then publish that in any paper that would take the story. In the strangest act of Klan charity, a Black church was given a donation that they immediately returned, because, it's the Klan. Across all my research for this video, no discovery shocked me more than the fact that not only did an explicitly white supremacist organization give a present to black people, but that it's happened twice. That's 2 nickels. Actually, no. Dr. Blee suggests that this was straight up a pattern with WKKK donations. So fuck it, let's get a boatload of nickels. Of course, the Klan's donations to black churches did have some clear political benefit, despite the apparent absurdity. By donating to a diverse pool of recipients, the Klan could appear to be less discriminatory than it actually was, and cement its reputation as a charitable body. In another apparent attempt to promote the idea of the Klan as non-discriminatory, the Indiana Klan would attempt to organize a colored division. The organizers of this division seemed to want to have their white cake and eat it too, as they claimed the new black Klansmen would have the same membership rights as the white Klansmen. However, the organization was to maintain its white supremacy, as black members were to wear special colored robes to distinguish their status, and would not be allowed to be seen in public with white Klansmen, or control any of the money. Aside, the other major component of Klan charity consisted of donations made to schools. These donations were typically of a Bible and/or American flag. Ostensibly, these were donated in an attempt to promote Protestant values. But less important than the actual gift was the act of gifting it. Klanswomen preferred to have the gifts given in a public ceremony, where Klanswomen in robe would present the gift to school officials. This not only generated positive press for the Klan, but served to normalize their presence in all realms of American public life. The women's Klan differed from the men's in their ideology as well. While Klansmen's claims that the organization was the best protector of women's rights were largely empty talk to attract recruits, many Klanswomen were concerned with advancing women's rights. Many WKKK members supported suffrage, women's employment, child welfare policies, and even in a few instances, reproductive rights, with a New Jersey Klan chapter arranging a speech from birth control advocate Margaret Sanger. This was likely a product of the fact that many women arrived to the Klan through prior involvement in women's activism. It's not even that the Klan was particularly feminist. As historian Linda Gordon notes, Klanswomen's family values differed little, if at all, from those of most non-Klan women. But Klan feminism stands out because for women involved in right-wing movements, we typically expect their policies to take an anti-feminist, deferential slant. We saw this with the UDC, where despite engaging in political work, the women didn't really challenge gender norms, as their activities were viewed as women's work, and we'll see it more when we get to the 50s. Klan feminism was always a means to an end, though, with their activism being characterized by how they used white Protestant women's rights to attack the groups they opposed. Their support for suffrage was, in part, so they could neutralize the votes of black people and immigrants. Central to their child welfare advocacy was their attacks on Catholic schools, and their interest in the birth control movement was likely increased by its unfortunate allies in the eugenics movement. The downfall of the WKKK and the Second Klan as a whole would begin in 1925. D.C. Stevenson, the leader of the Indiana Klan, had already garnered a reputation for mistreating women when he invited a young woman named Madge Oberholtzer to his mansion. Upon her arrival, he drugged her and dragged her onto a train, where she was brutalized. Oberholtzer would die a few weeks later from a combination of her injuries and mercury poisoning from an attempt on her life she made during the attack. She would not die before delivering her testimony against Stevenson, however. He would be convicted and sentenced to life in prison for rape, kidnapping, and second-degree murder. The case received the same nasty reception that most of this nature do, with one Klansman remarking, "It's too bad she died, but what did she go up there with him for?" Despite the, to be expected, evilness of the Klan with regards to their appraisal of Oberholtzer, the Stevenson conviction dealt a serious blow to the organization. For starters, they had lost the leader of the most powerful chapter in the country. Furthermore, The Stevenson case served to damage the Klan's reputation and disillusioned many of its members. From the very start, the Klan had built itself up by stressing the immoral, sexually debaucherous threat posed by Black, Catholic, and Jewish people. Remember, in The Birth of a Nation, the sexual advances of a Black man towards a white woman is a central motivator of the Klan's founding. Every Klan's member was supposedly there to fight this immorality. So when it turned out the call was coming from inside the house, the organization crumbled. By 1928, the Indiana Klan had only 4,000 members. By 1930, only 6 years removed from its peak, the KKK as a whole had less than 50,000. Internal strife and rampant corruption that the Klan had been able to weather while it was growing quickly brought it down when the veil of respectability, which they had worked tirelessly to maintain, was finally removed. And while the Klan would twice again be revived, women were to play no significant role in any KKK movement going forward. Part 3. Women and the First Red Scare. One of the most interesting movements of the early 20th century was the anti-suffrage movement. Because while most right-wing women's movements are, to some extent, fighting against their own rights, it rarely gets as blatant as women fighting their own voting rights. That was the mission of the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. The NOWS was a political organization run by women who didn't think women had any place in political work. They were able to overcome this ideological contradiction because they believed that it was only through betraying their role as proper ladies that they could prevent suffrage, which they believed would bring about the collapse of the social order by destroying traditional family life and introducing sinister forces like feminism, socialism, and Mormonism. NOW's activism consisted mostly of disseminating anti-suffrage propaganda, running a newsletter, the Women's Protest, later renamed Women's Patriot. They also distributed pamphlets such as this one, titled "Some Reasons Why We Oppose Votes for Women." Going through the list, we see some gems such as, "It'd be a burden on the taxpayers. Voting rights didn't fix the problems with men, so there's no point to women voting. Women already spend all their time doing women things, so trying to get them to vote too is actually an attack on their rights." And my personal favorite, because it means simply doubling the vote, and especially the undesirable and corrupt vote of our large cities. I love this because it means the dumbass narrative about elections being controlled by a few big cities is literally over a century old. The anti-suffrage movement would, of course, eat mad shit with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Conservative women's activism was only getting started, however. With suffrage victory, women's orgs across the country no longer had a single goal that they were almost all working towards, and many women involved in suffrage had held right-wing beliefs that would shape their work going forwards. They would be joined by many women who had previously opposed suffrage. Now that the right to vote had been thrust upon them, these women considered themselves obligated to use it. Once again, their focus would be on preventing the infiltration of socialism into American public life. The 1917 Russian Revolution kicked off a Red Scare in the US, with many of those opposed to Bolshevik politics, afraid of radicalism lurking behind every corner. The 1919 Seattle General Strike was a sign to many that America was on the brink of revolution. Anti-radicalism would take on special significance for women, because many women would come to perceive a unique threat posed by communism to their status as women. The government made sure of that. In 1919, the Overman Committee, which was a spiritual predecessor to the House Un-American Activities Committee, released a report which, among other things, detailed the treatment of women following the revolution. Witnesses claimed the communists legalized abortion, promoted divorce, destroyed families, put women and children under state control, and forced women to register with a Bureau of Free Love. Many women saw the institution of marriage as a tool for their own protection, and worried that if it were destroyed, men would lose their responsibility to protect their wives, and women would lose that safety. This perceived threat would drive thousands towards conservative women's organizations. And where the Red Scare bolstered conservative women, it dealt a massive blow to progressive women. Feminist policy still had some wins following the Red Scare, such as the 1921 Shepard-Towner Act, which funded prenatal and child health care. But with the lack of a common goal post-suffrage, the women's movement would struggle to find a purpose that wasn't fight communism. And for those who didn't fight communism hard enough, condemnation followed. In 1924, Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent published the Spiderweb chart. The chart is part of the grand tradition of crackpot theories where you just connect a bunch of things with lines. In this specific example, women's orgs and pacifist orgs are linked with the threat of socialist revolution, effectively labeling 16 of the most influential women's groups, as well as 30 specific women, communists. The chart would gain further credence when it was discovered to have come out of the United States Department of War. The Secretary of War would eventually address the chart, issuing an apology, but by that point the chart had spread, and the right was running with the narrative. This wrecked the reputations of those implicated in the chart, and drove a wedge between many of the groups, as they sought to rehabilitate their image by disavowing others listed on the chart. The main mind behind the chart was Chemical Warfare Service librarian Lucia Ramsey Maxwell, who relied on her network of conservative women's activists when constructing the chart. The fact that it was Maxwell who created the chart challenged a misguided belief held by many women's reformers, that women would not attack other women. They blamed the chart on the men of the War Department, and viewed the women who spread it as simply being influenced by powerful men. In the view of right-wing women, however, not only could they attack women's organizers, they saw themselves as the only ones who could do so. In order to defeat radical women, they needed the efforts of anti-radical women. The largest organization to take up the anti-radical agenda, with 150,000 members at the time, was the Daughters of the American Revolution. The DAR, formed in 1890, was a hereditary organization for descendants of those who aided in the American revolutionary effort. The group's celebration of US militarism and its strong ties with patriotism made it an ideal candidate to fight the alleged threat of pacifists and socialism. Maxwell was well immersed in the DAR, regularly attending their meetings while she was working on the Spiderweb chart. So, after contributing to the weakening of rival women's orgs, the DAR was primed to move forward as perhaps the most influential women's group. Their first major blow would be revoking a deal to rent a DAR-owned auditorium to the National Council of Women for their large international meeting. The DAR, and conservative women at large, would lambast the NCW with endless accusations of being a communist, internationalist organization. The NCW was a fairly centrist women's rights org, and had been organizing this specific event for 40 years with no such protests. But in a post-Spider Chart society, that didn't really matter. The NCW's attempts to purge any pacifist groups from its ranks did little to stem the attacks. Anti-radical activists successfully lobbied the government to deny their requests for funds, and the DAR called on patriotic women to leave the organization. This concentrated effort would drive the NCW into irrelevancy, and showed the power anti-radical women had. These anti-radical women would use that power to protect America's most important freedom, child labor. After several laws which sought to address the issue were overturned by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, a bipartisan consensus emerged in 1924, supporting a constitutional amendment known as the Child Labor Amendment, which would allow Congress to make laws regulating child labor. Basically everyone liked the idea. It went through Congress with a massive margin, and seemed certain to be ratified. That is, until the editors of The Woman Patriot testified to Congress that the amendment was part of a Soviet plot, which would nationalize the children and put them under the influence of the government rather than their parents. Truly, this amendment would have been a fatal blow to the American dream of 10-year-olds losing limbs in textile mills. As dumb as it seems, the anti-radical campaign killed the amendment. By 1930, only 6 states had ratified the amendment. Even after the Red Scare orgs fell from power, the amendment would never get the states needed to pass. The Woman Patriot would spread the same narrative about Shepherd Towner when it came up for renewal in 1927, ultimately defeating the bill and demonstrating the extent to which, in just a few short years, conservative women had come to completely dominate the narrative on women's organizing. Since feminist organizers tended to rely on the narrative that their policies were desired by all women, the mere presence of visible right-wing women was able to undercut any push for these policies. When they weren't lobbying to make people's lives worse, the DAR were also committed to looking for any signs of radicalism they could find. Volunteers went through programs and pamphlets from radical meetings, read newspapers from across the political spectrum, and even paid to have foreign language papers translated, all in order to find radical quotes to put in their propaganda. The DAR would also campaign directly against those they perceived as Reds, lobbying local governments to ban their meetings and attempting to kick them out of their communities. The organization's tactics would attract significant scrutiny in 1928, when it came out that the DAR had created and distributed blacklists of so-called Reds. These lists were used by local chapters to inform their protests. Peace activist Lucia Ames Mead would have her talks canceled and filled with anti-radical hecklers for the rest of her career after her name appeared on the DAR blacklist. Women's rights activists had suspected the DAR had some sort of blacklist well before the press broke the story. But once the lists were public, people were able to see that these weren't comprehensive lists of communist activists within the US, but were instead mostly just women's rights and peace advocates who the DAR didn't like. The lists were called slanderous and created quite an optics problem for the DAR, as an organization which was ostensibly meant to celebrate American revolutionary principles was shown to be not so fond of free speech. When this information came out, there were attempts from within the organization to enact reform. Some members who had joined for hereditary reasons were upset with the anti-radical agenda that had come to dominate the group. These attempts were soundly defeated, with those present at their annual convention siding with the anti-radical agenda, even in the wake of the controversy. And the members who had protested that agenda found themselves kicked out of the organization shortly after. Ultimately, it didn't matter that the blacklists attracted controversy. Much like the spiderweb chart, the public still took away the message of progressive women's organizing being the realm of subversive communists who needed to be stopped. The women's movement spent so much time denying the claims and distancing themselves from each other that they crumbled. The Women's Joint Congressional Committee, a coalition group of women's orgs, which had been instrumental to the initial passage of the Shepherd Towner Act, saw many of its member orgs leave. The League of Women Voters, the organization which succeeded the National American Women's Suffrage Organization, had such difficulty finding allies in a post-blacklist world that they were driven to the point of irrelevancy. Their Wikipedia page has a single line for the entire 1930s. It's that bad. And organizations that did stick around had their platforms driven right internally, as conservative club women protested. The DAR would have a few more notable accomplishments in the pre-war era, lobbying for textbooks that stressed the heroism of warrior patriots to be used in classes, to inculcate the nation's youth with their jingoistic ideals. Anti-radical women were instrumental in the campaign to turn the Star-Spangled Banner into the national anthem, a campaign which proved successful, much like an earlier DAR campaign, which changed part of the Pledge of Allegiance from "To my flag" into "To the flag of the United States of America." While their attempts to divert the nation towards a more militaristic, patriotic identity were successful, the greatest accomplishment of the DAR and the anti-radical movement as a whole may have been their mere existence. By existing, they robbed women's organizers of the ability to claim to speak for all women, an ability that they would never get back, with right-wing women continuing on as perhaps the most powerful force against progressive women's organizers. Part 4. Elizabeth Dilling and the World War II Mothers Movement. Elizabeth Dilling was one of the leading figures in anti-communist activism during the New Deal era. A wealthy heiress whose first husband, Albert, was himself a wealthy engineer-turned-lawyer, Dilling was frightened at the prospect of losing her privileged social standing. This led her to oppose New Deal politics. Her own politics of anti-communism would become solidified following a 1931 trip to the Soviet Union. Dilling described seeing rampant poverty, starving children, infrastructure neglected to the point of disrepair, and what she saw as mistreatment of women due to sex equality with men. Dilling was perhaps most upset by the Soviet approach to Christianity. She bemoaned seeing displays ridiculing Jesus and Christianity, as well as plans to tear down churches. In her view, the Soviets were attempting to replace Jesus with Vladimir Lenin, who she did not consider a particularly worthy substitute. Dilling's fears were maximized when her, as she claims, Jewish tour guides told her communism was soon to conquer America. Upon her return to the States, Dilling would almost immediately begin lecturing on the threat of communism abroad and where she saw it cropping up domestically. Due to her connections, Dilling was able to speak at many church groups, and with her skill as an orator, she quickly began to speak to a wide variety of audiences across the country on lecturing tours. Dilling was determined to catalog every communist influence active in the US, and spent almost all of her time reading newspapers, magazines, and other publications in order to identify who was red. These efforts would culminate in her 1934 book, The Red Network, a who's who and handbook of radicalism for patriots. Much like the previous spiderweb chart, this book aimed to give anti-communists a guide for who to direct their vitriol towards. And much like the spiderweb chart, it was poorly made and inaccurate. To quote from historian Glenn Jeanson, whose book Women of the Far Right informs the bulk of this section, poorly written, the text lacked professional editing. It was filled with long, unwieldy quotations from ultra-right writers, and typographical, spelling, and grammatical errors. More importantly, the book was a mass of innuendo and inaccuracy, relying on guilt by association and fraudulent sources. Safe to say, the book held next to no value, which is why it's no surprise that the anti-communist movement lapped it up like hungry kittens. The book sold 16,000 copies by 1941, with thousands more given away, and received the endorsement of various right-wing organizations, including the KKK and the DAR, and would be referenced by anti-communist activists for years to come. Particularly notable is the anti-Semitism which permeated Dilling's work, and would earn her the label Female Führer in the German press. Dilling published her second book, The Roosevelt Red Record and Its Background, in 1936, ahead of the presidential election. The book was, somehow, even worse than her prior effort. In an attempt to catalog Roosevelt's leading role in the communist movement, in addition to expanding her list of communists, Dilling would create a copy-paste mashup of newspaper and magazine clippings, which, among other things, criticized Roosevelt's Jew deal, her words, for bringing communism to America, and contained one quote which went on for 6 pages. Once again, her audience of far-right activists saw the book as a triumph. Dilling's third book, The Octopus, would be published in 1940. In this book, she would advance the claim that Jewish people were the force behind the emergence and spread of communism, fully leaning into the anti-Semitism that had been less blatant in her prior works. The book was published under a pseudonym to prevent damage to her reputation, and was well received by American anti-Semites. The Octopus would come at an ideal time for it to be well received, as a movement had been brewing in the US for decades which sought to revive the ideas of the Populist Party in a manner suitable for a far-right agenda. Instead of a narrative of farmers being oppressed by corporate oligarchs, it was a nebulous middle class being oppressed by international bankers, union leaders, and New Deal administrators, groups which they sought to make synonymous with Jewish people, using evidence such as the previously discussed Protocols of the Elders of Zion, as well as the fact that Roosevelt appointed a few Jewish people to serve in his administration. These people really didn't have high standards for proof. It was this culture of right-wing populist anti-Semitism that informed Dilling, as well as the larger right-wing anti-war movement. Shortly after the Nazi invasion of Poland, 3 California mothers would form the National Legion of Mothers of America, a group which protested against U.S. entry into the war. This may seem in conflict with the position held by groups like the DAR, which championed U.S. militarism and cast mothers who would refuse to send their sons to fight as unpatriotic. However, there was also a belief among the American right that the values of America should always take top priority. In the 30s, this idea took the form of protesting U.S. charity to foreign nations, and with the war, took the form of protesting American troops dying for a war between foreign nations. When a war is viewed as having nothing to do with America, it's easy to rationalize that opposing U.S. entry isn't unpatriotic. The NLMA narrative held mass appeal for mothers of all political stripes, with the organization being officially nonpartisan. In practice, however, the group's leaders were generally conservatives. This showed in the org's newspaper, which spread claims that European refugees were overwhelmingly communists. The peak of NLMA activists would come in early 1941 with the Lend-Lease Act. This was an act that would allow the US to supply its allies with aid, such as military equipment, while maintaining an official position of neutrality. The Mothers Movement opposed this because, in their eyes, it was one step closer to entry into the war. Following the bill being passed in the House, Elizabeth Dilling and several hundred mothers went to D.C. to protest the bill directly. While their lobbying was passionate, resulting in Dilling being arrested twice, the protest would eventually dissipate when the Senate passed the bill a month later. Lend-Lease would also mark the beginning of the end for the NLMA, which had become beset by internal issues. While Dilling did not officially endorse the org, many other prominent anti-Semites did. Much to the dismay of NLMA President Kathleen Norris, anti-Semitism began to cement itself within the more extremist factions of the organization. The Philadelphia and New York groups both left to form their own organizations whose opposition to the war entry were more driven by anti-Semitism. Following the Pearl Harbor attacks, Norris, who had left the organization in September, would support U.S. entry into the war. The Mothers Movement would decline thereafter, but many chapters, in the model of Philadelphia and New York, broke off and continued their anti-war protesting. Dilling would also oppose the war effort after the Pearl Harbor attacks, but would be unable to do much as her time was occupied by a messy divorce and libel case against her husband. The libel case, which she would eventually drop, revealed that Dilling had written The Octopus, and following her eventual divorce, Dilling would claim her marriage had been perfect until the intervention of a Jewish plot to make her husband cheat on her a bunch. I thought this was neat because it really gets to the heart of anti-Semitism and bigotry in general, often just being an attempt to create an external target to receive the anger over one's unrelated personal problems, particularly in the case of women, as conservative familial values dictate they must defer to their husband. So in the instance of a husband's wrongdoing and absence of any force to aid them, they may channel their anger into bigotry, as they cannot openly direct it towards their husband, the one who's actually done them harm. It's also just really funny. Ultimately, the World War II Mothers Movement accomplished relatively little in terms of concrete achievements. While Dilling's writings would go on to influence right-wing thinkers for decades, and the anti-Semitism of many mothers' organizations was very real, they failed in their main goal. The US joined the war. This movement was not a complete failure, however. It would go on to be used later in this video, where I look at what draws women to the right. And arguably just as important, it cemented anti-communist activism as an acceptable realm for conservative women, and demonstrated the potential power of a mother's movement, a potential that would soon be unleashed. Part 5. The post-war women's movements. Following the war, conservative activism would see a massive resurgence. The publication of books like Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom and other works from the Austrian School of Economics provided a convincing argument for some in favor of libertarianism, and the massive popularity of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead spread these ideas to the masses. In 1946, Leonard Read would found the Foundation for Economic Education, a think tank devoted to further spreading libertarianism. Nowhere in the country did these ideas take stronger root than in Los Angeles, where middle-class housewives would become some of the most active and passionate workers for the conservative cause. They were able to dedicate much more of their time to the cause because many of them didn't have jobs. In fact, for many women, conservative activism filled the void professional work would have, allowing them to spread their political values while alleviating the soul-crushing effect of being a housewife in the 1950s. These women would hold meetings, attend and deliver speeches, and create newsletters concerning the threat of communism. The home became a place where conservative club women could assemble for study groups, meetings, and political campaigning. Jean Ward Fuller, president of the California Federation of Republican Women, noted how her group could send out 20,000 mailers a day, working just from her home. As a result of these activities, conservative women's activism exploded in popularity. By 1958, there were 500,000 women active in Republican women's clubs, with over 50,000 from California. Two of the more notable organizations were the Minute Women and the American Public Relations Forum. The AFPR hosted monthly meetings and organized letter-writing campaigns to politicians. The Minute Women were a much larger, more national org at around 50,000 members, and had one of the most interesting organizational structures I've read about. Minute Women were never supposed to reveal that they were Minute Women, so that the organization could appear to be a massive wave of unaffiliated, concerned citizens, rather than a single group. Members would receive most of their group-related info through the newsletter, rather than actual meetings. And both groups believed that women had a divine mandate to defend American freedom. This defense took many forms. Club women followed in the grand tradition of conservative activism in the education system, but had a focus on the local level, generally not seen in prior movements. This can be seen in the case of Pasadena, where in 1951, a conservative parents' movement succeeded in removing Willard Goslin as school superintendent. Goslin caught the ire of conservative activists for his embrace of progressive education, which the right believed meant lowered educational standards. His perceived attempts at race mixing, and the idea that his policies took power over the children away from their parents. Conservative women launched a campaign opposing Goslin and his policies, and were successful in driving voter turnout to block his attempts to raise the school budget, eventually generating so much negative discussion around him that the Board of Education asked him to resign. The Goslin case demonstrates how conservative women wished to characterize themselves and their opponents. Goslin, a Columbia graduate, was framed as an outsider who brought trouble to Pasadena, while the many conservative women who moved to Pasadena from elsewhere were not. One of the prominent activists argued that the city did not have a racism problem until Goslin's arrival. Meanwhile, the city had a history of segregation and redlining, and one of the other prominent activists considered any civil rights movement inherently communistic. These women played up their credentials as housewives and common people, but never hesitated to share their impressive educational credentials. This would characterize much of the women's activism of the Cold War period. Their opponents were always the aberrant force, infecting the community. This slant would be seen again in the campaign against UNESCO. UNESCO, or the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, is a UN group which aims to promote world peace and junk. One of the methods by which they attempted to do this in the US was through education, creating teaching manuals to help teachers promote internationalist values in the classroom, and sponsoring essay contests. Perceiving UNESCO as an internationalist, communist organization, which cast conservative patriots as enemies and promoted race mixing, a group of conservative women, led by writer Florence Fowler Lyons, organized a campaign against it, successfully getting the LA Board of Education to drop all UNESCO programs in 1953. This would once again turn into a national campaign, with anti-UNESCO groups across the country pressuring officials to ban UNESCO materials, and campaigning to place their own anti-UNESCO candidates on school boards. Lyons' reputation rose to such an extent that she was invited to speak in front of a Senate subcommittee. She wasn't there to talk about UNESCO, she was there to offer testimony as to whether a State Department employee was a Soviet spy, but she went on a rant about UNESCO instead. And Joseph McCarthy loved it so much, he offered to commission a report from her. The Cold War was really stupid. Right-wing women were also instrumental in killing the American Heritage Project. The AHP was a project of the American Library Association to celebrate its 75th anniversary. The ALA contracted Henry Steele Commager to edit a collection of writings from notable US figures, from founding fathers to feminist leaders to labor activists and civil rights leaders. This collection, titled Living Ideas in America, was made available in public libraries, who would also host discussion groups. Conservative women opposed this project because Commager was an opponent of McCarthyism, supporter of the New Deal, and, in their view, editorialized too much and didn't adequately present their perspective in Living Ideas. After much campaigning, right-wing women were successful in getting funding for the project cut. Conservative women were an essential component of the cultural shift of the Red Scare. Before the first issue of the National Review was ever published, heralding what many historians consider the start of the American conservative movement, conservative women had already sent a message that they would be there to deliver constant, steady, organized resistance to anything they viewed as a threat to their values. This killed many projects, but a countless number were likely abandoned before ever getting started, or never received funding due to fear of the near certain backlash to follow. According to historian Ellen Schrecker, during the height of the McCarthy era, the National Science Foundation explicitly warned prospective applicants to steer clear of social reform movements and welfare activities. Aside from the activism led primarily by them, women would also play an important role in right-wing organizations led by men. In 1958, Robert Welch founded the John Birch Society. The JBS was committed to an anti-communist agenda and built on much of the pre-existing grassroots conservative movement created by women. Women were involved as Birchers, and some chapters were even all women. But the nature of the JBS was that men were always in charge, reflecting the patriarchal values that characterize conservatism. At the first JBS meeting, the only woman present was there to serve coffee to the men, and at chapter meetings, women would typically take a back seat in discussions and provide refreshments. Historian Michelle M. Nickerson argues that this apparent acceptance of total subservience within movement work is perhaps not a full picture of how right-wing women perceived their role in the movement. In her book, Mothers of Conservatism, which informs the bulk of this section, She points out that the JBS was rarely a woman's only form of participation in the movement, writing that female members submitted enthusiastically to the gender hierarchy, hostessing and serving food at chapter meetings because Welch and others involved with the society inspired them. But then they came home and got back to work on the political tasks they juggled for the 2, 3, or 5 other organizations. It must have been easy for female members to sit back at chapter meetings, after serving some coffee perhaps, and let the dentist who lived around the corner lead the discussion for a change. While the JBS may have been many men's primary engagement with the conservative cause, for women it was just a single component meant to deepen their engagement with conservative thought. The idea of deepening conservative thought would be furthered with the founding of Poor Richard's Bookshop in LA in 1960. Operated by JBS member Florence Ranuzzi, the bookshop was created to educate people on anti-communist ideas, offering a bevy of relevant reading materials. The store would also come to serve as a hub for producing political materials, with volunteers helping to make bumper stickers and leaflets. Poor Richard's kicked off a conservative bookstore movement in LA, with stores opening across the country, most of them ran by women. One of the main targets of these stores was the youth, fearful of the potential brainwashing of children into communist ideals, free love, and juvenile delinquency. Many of these bookstores held youth groups, offered materials to teachers, and even mailed books directly to high school seniors post-graduation. In 1964, presidential candidate Barry Goldwater sought to harness the power of politically active women for his campaign, creating the Goldwater Gals, who wore cowgirl outfits and served as hostesses, servers, and cheerleaders at campaign events. Women joined because they were attracted to Goldwater's stance on anti-communism and being really fucking racist. The Goldwater Gals provided a lot of value to the campaign, improving campaign events through their service, projecting a veneer of polite respectability, which Goldwater could contrast with civil rights protesters, and contributing funds, as the golden hats they all wore cost $12.75, which, adjusted for inflation, is $130 for a hat. Holy mackerel. Goldwater also sought to channel the power of conservative women through astroturfing, with polls showing him trailing Lyndon B. Johnson. Barry Boy needed a way to repackage his ideas for wider appeal. Enter the organization Mothers for Moral America. Starting with the name, the Goldwater campaign worked backwards to fill the organization with notable women, but still exerted control over the organization's actions. The main purpose of the group was to present Goldwater's law and order platform through the more palatable vessel of concerned mothers. This would be done through the creation of arguably the most infamous attack ad in history, Choice, a 30-minute long film loaded with clips of race riots, student demonstrations, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, baby! Throughout the film, freaky, scary music plays, while a narrator rants about how America used to be so poggers, until something happened. And we're not gonna say what that something is. We're gonna show these clips of civil rights protesters, but that could be completely unrelated. Maybe America's decay into immorality is because the Detroit Lions stopped winning NFL championships. Who can say? The ad also depicts Lyndon B. Johnson as a drunk driver. Now, previously, a Johnson ad had heavily implied that a Goldwater win would mean nuclear annihilation. So, the bar was set for taking low blows. But that's the thing. Goldwater didn't take the blow. He laundered it through a fake women's org, which he made pretend not to be associated with him. When the mothers showed the film to the press, it was decried for being sick and profane, and, so obviously racist. Goldwater immediately denounced the film in an attempt to dodge the bad press, but it didn't help much. Johnson nearly swept the election, and while Goldwater flipping the South is important for the history of political realignment, we're supposed to be talking about women. And you know who's a woman? Phyllis Schlafly. The 60s and 70s saw a resurgence in progressive feminist activism, larger than anything since the suffrage movement. Part of this second wave was a revived attempt to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Written in 1923, and then updated in 1943 by suffrage leader Alice Paul, the first section reads, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States, or by any other states on account of sex," with the other two sections giving Congress the power to enforce the amendment and setting a 2-year timer for when it would take effect. Initially, the amendment seemed destined to pass, being approved by Congress in 1972 with little pushback, but then Schlafly happened. Phyllis Schlafly, an attorney and writer, had been active in conservative politics for over 2 decades by the time of the ERA, running a failed congressional campaign in a majority Democrat Illinois district. Following the loss, Schlafly would keep involved in party politics, in addition to work in conservative women's organizations, such as the previously discussed American Public Relations Forum, which she aided with publishing educational materials and designing agendas for study groups. Schlafly was also a member of the even more previously mentioned Daughters of the American Revolution. She wrote for their magazine and edited for their newsletter. She spoke at their meetings and developed a national following. Her profile would increase further with the publication of her 1964 pamphlet, A Choice, Not an Echo, written in support of Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign. While the pamphlet helped him secure the nomination, we already saw how that turned out. Schlafly's political career would take a turn for the awful in 1971, when she was invited to speak on the proposed Equal Rights Amendment. After reading the ERA, Schlafly decided it posed a major threat to women. In 1972, Schlafly published What's Wrong with Equal Rights for Women, an essay in which she presents her opposition to the ERA. Schlafly argues that society is centered around the fact that women have babies and men don't, and thus the institution of the family exists to provide a space in which a woman can be free to have a baby and be financially supported by her husband. She argues that true women's liberation has been achieved through the creation of tools like the sewing machine and appliances which make the women's duties easier to accomplish. The feminist movement, she argues, is merely a small minority of women who seek to imbue 100 million housewives with the false narrative that they are oppressed and discriminated against. But these women's libers do not speak for the vast majority of women, who are not willing to forfeit their special privileges as housewives and mothers in a misguided push for equality. Throughout the essay, Schlafly makes frequent references to this being God's design, and invoking the idea of Judeo-Christian society in order to appeal to the religious right and lend her shoddy arguments a divine backing. First off, it's absolutely wild to pull out real women's liberation is when they invented the bread slicer, so women could more easily make me a fucking sandwich, and then accuse the other side of demeaning women. But more importantly, she adopts the framing we saw employed earlier with the progressive education debate. Women's libers are cast as the outsiders, infecting the natural world of traditional marriage and introducing all sorts of problems. Schlafly also makes sure to frame the movement as loud but tiny. Meanwhile, her legions of tradwives make up the silent majority of women. In reality, Schlafly's arguments were totally bogus, dude. As Backlash author Susan Faludi details, most of the protections she argued the ERA would get rid of either didn't exist, with half of states having no laws that a husband had to support his wife, wouldn't be affected, as many protections could stay in place by simply changing to sex-neutral language, which is why the ERA had a 2-year grace period to adjust laws accordingly, or were just bad, such as many labor protections, which prevented women from getting higher-paying jobs. With the benefit of hindsight, we're also able to see that many of the things Schlafly claimed the ERA would do happened regardless. Claims that the ERA would lead to gay marriage were already dumb, as sexual orientation discrimination isn't generally considered sex-based discrimination. But now that gay marriage is legal, they're double dumb. Schlafly was also wrong in claiming to be the silent majority. Her organization, Stop ERA, never came close to the membership of the feminist National Organization of Women. And opinion polls indicate that the vast majority of women supported the ERA. The power of Schlafly's movement was not in being correct or speaking for the majority of women. It was simply in existing as a visible woman-led opposition to the ERA. Much like the DAR 50 years earlier, simply challenging the idea that the feminist position was held by all women was enough. The fact that Schlafly was a widely respected speaker and writer who did pull a lot of women to her side was just icing on the cake. In 1979, the ERA reached its deadline, short of the necessary states. Congress passed a 3-year extension, but to no avail. The ERA deadline would pass, with the amendment failing. The prominence of women like Schlafly gave conservative men the leeway to oppose feminist policies without having to come off as just unilaterally anti-woman. When Nixon vetoed the 1971 Comprehensive Child Development Act, which would have established universally accessible childcare, he invoked the messaging of conservative women that daycare was a communist institution, which threatened to break up the institution of the family. And while Roe v. Wade succeeded at first, in the decades of anti-abortion attacks following, the right made sure to center the role of women as mothers. Maternalism was also heavily invoked in Anita Bryant's Save Our Children campaign. A former Miss Oklahoma, singer, and spokeswoman for Orange Juice, Bryant would get her entry into conservative politics in 1977 when she protested an anti-discrimination ordinance in Miami, Florida. Founding the organization Save Our Children to collect signatures, Bryant saw the threat of homosexuality, like many other threats perceived by right-wing women, as a threat to the institution of the family. She argued that deviant homosexuals recruited kids to the gay agenda, an argument that has stood largely unchanged for decades now, with the recent groomer narrative. Bryant's campaign would succeed, repealing the ordinance in a landslide, and setting up the conservative movement for many more attacks on queer rights in the coming decade. Of course, gay people would eventually mount a comeback, with some queer activists crediting Bryant as a force in reinvigorating the movement. Bryant, on the other hand, would see her career prospects dry up, and would twice file for bankruptcy. Here's her getting hit in the face with a pie. That brings us to the end of right-wing women's movements I wanted to cover. By now, I feel we've established some of the more common traits exhibited across these movements. But we still only barely touched on why women join these movements. What is it that draws women to the right? Act 2. An analysis of right-wing women. Across the books I read for this project, I found a wide variety of reasonings for why women would be drawn to right-wing politics. I also had a couple thoughts of my own that I was able to evaluate through these books. In this second act, we'll be going through several hypotheses for why women might be drawn to the right, and looking at whether they hold up under scrutiny. To start, we'll be looking at the theories that, based on my research, don't prove to be true for the vast majority of right-wing women. Part 1. The Garbo theories. The first theory I'd like to take a look at is the idea that women are primarily drawn to the right out of ignorance. That is to say that these women have neglected to properly inform themselves on politics. I think this partially arises from a belief among the left that our ideas are so good and correct that those who disagree likely haven't bothered to inform themselves, as well as a belief that conservatives are just kinda dumb. In his book, The Reactionary Mind, Corey Robin describes how historians have tended to characterize the right as less intellectually driven and more emotionally driven. He points out that this characterization is one parroted by many conservatives themselves, as they seek to give their arguments a veil of Common sense. Robin argues that this is a false narrative, and that conservatism has a long intellectual tradition. We see this in the actions of right-wing women. Across every book I read, I was struck by the sheer amount of research right-wing women engaged in. Opponents of the American Heritage Project flexed the research on communist subversion while speaking against it, with one claiming to have read a stack of books higher than this table. Post-war activists read books and articles from conservative intellectuals, holding study groups to further their understanding. Let us not forget, the DAR was so committed to studying their enemies, they paid to have newspapers translated so they'd have more material to pore over. And one DAR leader straight up learned Russian so she could read communist propaganda. Elizabeth Dilling spent 30 years researching communists for hours a day. The women active in these movements did their research. Now, it wasn't necessarily good research. Glenn Jeanson writes how Dilling, in her studies, tended to read from a lot of unreliable sources, rejected any ideas that didn't conform to her pre-existing beliefs, and often misunderstood what she was even reading. Jeanson writes that her hatred of Jews seems to have arisen from a misunderstanding of Judaism, and an intolerance of faiths that differed from conventional Christianity. Learning more about their opponents did little to dissuade any of these women from their right-wing convictions. For many women, their political awakening was a direct result of learning more about the communist threat. And in the present, conservative women's activists speak of having their red pill moment, where they first seriously engaged with right-wing thought and were drawn to the cause because of what they learned. In lieu of ignorance, perhaps women are drawn to the right because they see it as an easy way to make some money. Before going any further, I'd like to take a second to remind y'all that I have a Patreon if you'd like to support the channel. Patreon. It's not grifting when I do it. There are many cases of women leveraging their right-wing activism into large wads of cash. Elizabeth Tyler earned hundreds of thousands of dollars for her role in promoting the KKK. And Women's Klan lecturer Nancy Taylor openly admitted she only joined the organization because they offered her money. Famous aviator Laura Ingalls was literally paid by the Third Reich to be a voice for pro-Hitler ideas in America. Today, we can point to figures like anti-trans activist Chloe Cole, who recently testified to bringing in up to $200,000 a year through speaking engagements, salary, and donations, and who I recently learned is 1 year younger than me. Having standards is really unprofitable. For many women on the right, their status as women is an essential component to their marketability. Phyllis Schlafly's status as a female voice against ERA was instrumental in propelling her national profile and bringing her lots of money through book sales. And Candace Owens' status as a Black woman is essential to her political narrative, particularly with regards to her Blexit, or Black Exit organization, which encourages Black people to leave the Democratic Party and has earned her $730,000 since 2019, when its tax filings became public. This grifter theory has a couple of very blatant issues, however. To start, in the vast majority of cases, it's impossible to say for certain that someone is only on the right because they get paid. The only exception is if they just admit it outright, like Nancy Taylor. Most right-wing women are very clearly true believers. If they were grifters, it would make more sense for them to maximize their profit. But they don't. Schlafly was active in party politics 18 years before writing her first book. Dilling, while she did bring in money from her books, lectures, and donations, she distributed her monthly bulletin for free. She often complained about not earning enough from her activism, but it's clear that she could have earned more and chose not to in order to spread her ideas as far as possible. And for Candace Owens, in the 5 years of tax filings we have for Blexit, she didn't take salary in 2 of those. Though, one of those is the most recent filing, where the organization reported $0 in assets and didn't pay any executive. And she had taken $250,000 the prior 2 years as the org reported massive losses. Okay, I know I said you can't know for certain that someone is a grifter, but some cases do warrant an educated guess. But the main issue with the grifter theory isn't that high-paid right-wing activists could still be genuine in their beliefs. It's that the vast majority of women don't make any money off of conservative activism. Every single women's movement we've looked at today has been built on countless hours of unpaid labor, contributed by women passionate about the cause. Oftentimes, these women lost money through their activism, paying to translate reading materials, contributing money to build Confederate monuments, and paying for those insanely expensive Goldwater hats. One theory that a few of the books I read pushed back on was the idea that many of the women who joined right-wing groups were doing so for non-political reasons. Rather than making their own informed decisions, these women are seen as simply following the examples of their husbands. Both of the books I read on the Klan pushed back on this narrative. Kathleen M. Blee, looking at a sample of 118 Indiana Klanswomen, found that at most, 78% of them had a husband during their time in the Klan. It'd be very generous to assume all of those women joined because of their husband. Blee also looked into one newspaper which listed Klan membership for men and women, as well as the address of the members. Through this paper, she found 19 women listed as Klan members, but only 5 of these women had a husband who was also in the Klan. Additionally, both Blee and Linda Gordon bring up how Klanswomen were often derided by the press and resented by their husbands for being overly involved in Klan activities, while neglecting their supposed duties in the home. Elizabeth Dilling also came to have her work resented by her husband. As an attorney, her husband Albert feared that Dilling's status as one of the nation's most prominent bigots might hurt his law practice. This was part of the reason why her most blatantly anti-Semitic work, The Octopus, was published under a pseudonym. In 1942, while suing Dilling following her filing for divorce, Albert would claim that her very public bigotry had made it impossible for him to earn any money as a lawyer. Women who become involved in these right-wing movements are typically doing so independent of, or even in spite of, their husbands. The idea that these women would only be driven to the right because of male influence is also fairly misogynistic. There's not really some counter theory that men are driven towards right-wing groups because of their wives, is there? The idea views the women in these movements in the same way Klansmen viewed them, as ideological infants who need to have their politics guided by a helping, masculine hand. The main issue with this theory is that it really isn't an explanation for why women are drawn to the right. It's more of an attempt to explain why women specifically joined these groups. With the John Birch Society, many men and women joined as couples, but that doesn't mean the husbands were ideologically molding their wives. The majority of married couples have similar political beliefs. These women, in almost all cases, are already right-wing. The husband theory just doesn't hold up. The final theory in the Garbo section is what I'm calling the pivot after a failed career theory. In recent years, people have noted how many prominent right-wing activists seem to have turned to conservative activism as a backup, following a lack of success in their first career choice. This is mainly leveled at conservative men, like Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles, and Steven Crowder, all of whom had careers in the entertainment industry with very little success prior to their activism. And of course, there's the obvious example of Adolf Hitler, who aspired to be an artist, but failed. This is also the case with a few right-wing women. Candace Owens had run a marketing agency and attempted to create an online platform which would compile the digital footprints of people in an attempt to dissuade trolling. This was roundly mocked for its obvious potential as a tool to dox people. And soon after, Owens was a conservative. Riley Gaines was a successful college swimmer, but following a single 5th-place tie to trans athlete Leah Thomas, she pivoted to anti-trans activism. And historian Glenn Jeanson believes that the right-wing activism of Elizabeth Dilling was spurred in part because of her failed dreams of being a professional musician, writing that her inability to become a professional harpist, leaving a void in her life, probably was profoundly disappointing. This failed career theory is obviously incorrect for much the same reasons as the grifter theory. There's even fewer women it could potentially apply to, and many people have failed careers and don't turn to conservative activism. I wanted to be a gastroenterologist when I was 12. I'm clearly never going to be that, but I'm not a conservative activist. This theory really just gets brought up because it's fun to mock prominent right-wing women for their past failures. Yep, I, a leftist, really get a kick out of treating these women poorly. I wonder if that could be a potential factor. Part 2. Is the left good for women? Throughout this whole video, we've been operating under the assumption that the right is inherently worse for women than the left. But is that necessarily true? In my readings, women's rights have often taken a back seat in progressive movements, sometimes being abandoned completely. The 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom is often heralded as one of the greatest moments in U.S. history. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech is arguably the most famous speech in American history. But in this momentous occasion for Black civil rights, the movement's women were practically absent. Women were essential to the civil rights movement. A large portion of the white people present at the march were only there thanks to the organizing efforts of Anna Arnold Hedgeman, the sole woman on the organizing committee. Despite the integral role of women, the other organizers of the march were content to leave them out of the proceedings. Political scientist Jean Theo Harris, in her book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, describes how, initially, the other march organizers had not arranged for even one woman to speak at the event. Despite the protests of Hedgeman and other women's activists, the men on the committee believed that it would be too difficult to find a single woman to speak at the event that wouldn't anger other women's groups who would go unrepresented. And while Hedgeman offered to find a woman who all the groups could agree on as their representative, and, there wasn't some concrete rule that they were only allowed to have one woman speak, the committee went in a different direction. 6 women were to be recognized in a tribute to women, where they would stand up and be applauded, before sitting back down quietly and demurely. The only woman who was slated to speak during the affair, NAACP organizer Daisy Bates, read off a short introduction, written by a man, which downplayed the role of women in the movement to one of merely supporting the male civil rights leaders. The Black Panther Party also saw female members mistreated. Women were essential to the party and frequently assumed leadership positions, and the party espoused a belief in gender-inclusive activist community. But many women within the party experienced unwanted sexual advances and threats from male members. One woman, Regina Jennings, described how when she sought help from the party's Central Committee in dealing with unwanted advances and harassment from the captain, she was told that her attitude of sexual abstinence was both foolish and counter-revolutionary. She was eventually sent off to a different division, punishing her rather than the captain, an experience shared by many other Panther women. The sexual availability of women to the men of these progressive groups was a significant point. One prominent poster for the Vietnam draft resistance movement reads, "Girls say yes to boys who say no." The women here are cast as willing objects for men's sexual desire. Rather than people in their own right, the poster portrays them more as a prize for good little boys who dodged the draft to collect. The woman, as willing sex partner to any men of the movement, was a pervasive idea in the sexual revolution and hippie movement of the 1960s. This idea that women should be open to sex in all circumstances, according to feminist author Andrea Dworkin, created a culture of rampant abuse, where women faced assault and social outcast status for their refusal. Dworkin also argues that the Democratic Party abandoned the fight for abortion rights during the 1970s, pointing out that 1972 presidential candidate George McGovern refused to take a stand in favor of abortion rights, that civil rights activist Jesse Jackson supported the 1976 Hyde Amendment, which cut Medicaid funding for abortion with few exceptions, and that President Jimmy Carter had federal funding of abortions halted while the Hyde Amendment was going through legal challenges. My favorite example for how the left seems at times to just give up completely on women's rights is Adlai Stevenson's 1955 speech, A Purpose for Modern Women, where, at a time when Republicans had reclaimed the White House for the first time in 20 years, one of the biggest names in the Democratic Party, who had already lost the 1952 election and was soon to lose the 1956 election, chose to meet the moment by speaking to a group of newly graduated women at the Smith College commencement ceremony and telling them that while they may find themselves disappointed that their education will appear increasingly irrelevant in a world in which they are only valued for their role as wives and mothers, they can find comfort in bettering the men around them. Which is just like, wow. Bro really went up to a crowd of women who had just graduated to tell them that their career ambitions will prove fruitless. But hey, at least they can fix him. And while left-wing women often experience mistreatment from left-wing men, right-wing women also often experience mistreatment from left-wing men. A lot of attacks on right-wing women take a very misogynist approach. In criticizing the Klan of the 1920s, progressive activists would often say Elizabeth Tyler was its true leader, mocking Klansmen for being ruled by a woman. Once the WKKK was established, husbands of Klan women were mocked for being unable to control their wives. Even today, right-wing women are the targets of a lot of sexism. Go into the comments section of literally any prominent right-wing woman, and you'll be able to find plenty of misogyny coming from the left. It reminds me of a common trope with transgender people, where following a trans person being outed as doing something bad, many supposed allies will proceed to misgender them, wielding bigotry as some sort of punishment, which shall be inflicted upon those who step outside the bounds of proper conduct as dictated by the left. Similarly, Candace Owens described receiving a wave of racist bullying following her attempts to create her doxing program, a wave she attributed to progressives involved in Gamergate. It appears that, when dealing with those on the right, many progressives neglect the intersectional principle of not being a dick. But there's a problem with using this leftist bigotry as a reason for why women are drawn to the right. It doesn't logically follow that if one sees the left as overly misogynistic, they'd find a home in conservatism. Because every problem I've discussed with the left is just as present, if not more so, in right-wing movements. There's been sexual misconduct, from D.C. Stevenson of the Indiana Klan to various right-wing organizations today. Not to mention Donald Trump and his whole deal. Women have been rendered a backing, supporting force in virtually every right-wing org they've inhabited with men. Let us not forget the Berkshire women left to wait on their male counterparts, or the Goldwater gals who only existed to do busy work for the campaign, soften his image, and buy those fucking hats. In terms of support for women's rights policy, while the Democratic Party has often come up short, the Republicans have almost always been the ones fighting these rights. And when it comes to bigoted harassment, well, go into the comments section of literally any prominent left-wing woman. But, they're sexist too isn't much of an argument. At least, not a convincing one. The prominence of sexism among the left, even if it's lesser in total volume than the sexism of the right, still creates an equivalency in the eyes of many concerning their treatment of women. And from the individual perspectives and experiences of many women, the left will come out as solidly the more misogynistic side. Once again, we can turn to Candace Owens, In the wake of her doxing website scandal, Owens describes the hate and vitriol she received from progressives, but says she found a home in Gamergate. I want to make it clear that I do believe Owens when she says that she received harassment from progressives. What I have a much harder time believing is that she received nothing but warm hugs and friendship from Gamergate. The idea that one of the largest misogynistic harassment campaigns ever organized would gleefully accept Owens, a black woman, whose internet troll doxing website would have created a serious issue for them, a movement made up of internet trolls, is laughable. But it doesn't matter what I believe. Owens believes the vitriol to have come from the left, and the kindness to have come from the right. Far-right figures such as Mike Cernovich are the only ones she mentions reaching out to offer sympathy in the height of her backlash. This framing of the right as more welcoming and accepting has become an integral part of right-wing argument, leading millions of women to accept this framing. Part 3. Right-wing women. In any discussion of right-wing women as a concept, you will invariably be turned towards Andrea Dworkin's 1983 book, Right-Wing Women. This is partially because, as far as I can tell, barely anyone is writing much on right-wing women. I'm fairly confident my reading list for this video covers most of the available scholarship. Humble bragging aside, Dworkin also presents one of the most believable theories concerning right-wing women. In the conclusion to her book, she writes, "More than anything else, it is anti-feminism that convinces right-wing women that the system of sex segregation and sex hierarchy is immovable, unbreachable, and inevitable, and therefore that the logic of their worldview is more substantive and compelling than any analysis, however accurate, of its flaws. It is not the anti-feminism of the right specifically that keeps the allegiance of these women. It is the anti-feminism that saturates political discourse, all along the political spectrum. The anti-feminism that permeates virtually all political philosophies, programs, and parties. Anti-feminism is not a form of political reaction and suppression confined to the far right. If it were, women would have compelling reason for moving away from the far right, towards philosophies, programs, and parties not fundamentally anti-feminist. This is why anti-feminist actions among the left are so crucial. The equivalency they establish is what makes these women open to choosing the right. I believe there's no greater example of the wider, culturally ubiquitous anti-feminism than the various feminist backlash movements we've seen throughout history. At every point where women have made serious political gains, or even just appeared like they could, there has been a large-scale effort to limit and push back on these gains. Following suffrage victory, the media sponsored debates on whether or not suffrage was a failure, and feminist activists were repeatedly slandered as communists. The second-wave feminism of the 60s and 70s brought about an onslaught of retaliatory action, as chronicled by journalist Susan Faludi, who popularized the term backlash in her 1991 book of the same name. Faludi details how, in the wake of perceived feminist progress, the 80s saw an avalanche of bad science on women becoming widely spread. In 1986, an at the time still unpublished study on marriage likelihood for educated women became a hot-button topic when a reporter reached out to its authors for a quote for some article. The Harvard-Yale study, as Faludi calls it, found that college-educated women had a 20% chance of ever getting married if they weren't married by 30, and only a 5% chance at 35. This information would spread across the nation, finding its way into popular media, from When Harry Met Sally to Fatal Attraction. Which, it's hard to really expect better from Adrian Lyne. As previously discussed on the channel, bro's got issues. This statistic created fear of a growing man shortage, that women who opted to focus on their education and career before family would come out on the other end unable to find a husband, the classic feminist spinster narrative. The problem was that this study wasn't very good. Drawing from a fairly small population of women and using a newer parametric model to predict women's behavior, which hadn't been used for this sort of research previously. Faludi describes how, upon hearing of this study, Census Bureau demographer Jean Mormon decided to do her own study, pulling from a much more representative sample of 13.4 million households instead of the Harvard-Yale study's 60,000, and using standard methodology as opposed to the parametric model. Mormon found that the actual likelihood of marriage was significantly higher, around 60% at 30 and 35% at 35. Crucially, she also found that education was not something which reduced a woman's chances at marriage. But Mormon's study would not get anywhere near the attention of the Harvard-Yale study. Few papers ever picked it up. The nation had already decided on a narrative they were willing to believe, that feminism was hurting women. This idea of the narrative being more relevant than any actual scientific findings is present in many other backlash studies. The 1989 book, Second Chance: Men, Women, and Children, a Decade After Divorce, concluded that children with divorced parents had worse outcomes based on nothing. The research didn't include a control group. A 1982 study in the New England Journal of Medicine claimed that women's fertility fell off precipitously after the age of 30. But this was based upon a small sample of women trying to conceive through artificial insemination, which is less effective, and defined infertility as not getting pregnant after a year of trying, which is just not what infertility is. But the best backlash study is one of the ones which popularized the idea of daycare centers as harmful to children. The study found that infants in the care of daycare workers suffered severe emotional distress. This research would be widely cited in articles attacking daycare facilities. But the study wasn't even on humans. It was on baby monkeys, in the care of fake dummies. And I'd contend, if you left a bunch of human infants in the care of fake dummies made of wire mesh, they would also be emotionally scarred. The prominent bad science in the wake of perceived feminist progress reflects the wider culture's anti-feminist leanings, willing to accept anything as long as it confirmed their biases that feminism was hurting women. The most insidious form of backlash came through the appropriation of feminism. To quote Faludi, by the mid-70s, the media and advertisers had settled on a line that served to neutralize and commercialize feminism at the same time. Women, the mass media seemed to have decided, were now equal and no longer seeking new rights, just new lifestyles. For the epitome of this idea, I'd like us to take a look at the wildest commercial I've ever seen. This 1969 ad for Virginia Slims cigarettes.
Back in the old days, men were the masters, women were the slaves. Women had the duties, men had all the rights. Then at last, women won their rights. And one by one, they won them all.
You've come a long way, baby, to get where you got to today. You've got your own cigarette now, baby. You've come a long, long way.
The message of this and other ads was clear. Feminism had already won. Women now had all the rights they needed. The most feminist thing a woman could do now was exercise her right to choose what products to buy. Brands were more than happy to oblige. The liberated woman, according to their advertisements, showed it by purchasing their swimsuits, their jewelry, their pantyhose. The lack of any actual commitment to feminist ideals by these brands was evident when, with the start of the Reagan era, positive portrayals of consumerist feminism were quickly abandoned, with the onslaught of previously mentioned junk science. Where the consumer feminist had once stood, a new ideal of womanhood emerged. The New Traditionalist. Popularized in the magazine Good Housekeeping, the New Traditionalist was basically just a trad wife. The ads claimed the New Traditionalist was making her own choice, to focus on being a stay-at-home wife and mother, moving away from career work. Rather than simply regressing back to what women were expected to do, the New Traditionalist was cast as starting a revolution. The New Traditionalists came from the idea of cocooning, that women were increasingly turning away from the office and moving home. This idea, popularized by marketer Faith Popcorn, was widely accepted by the media and corporations, despite labor statistics at the time showing only increases in women working and wanting to work. Once again, the actual reality wasn't as important as what the wider culture wanted to believe. Women were inundated with these false ideas of what they wanted, and while the media attempted to keep them passive, actual attacks on women's rights were taking off. The Equal Rights Amendment was killed in this era, and government programs such as the Women's Educational Equity Act program, which sought to protect against gender discrimination in education, were targeted for being perceived as feminist. The WEEA saw its funding cut and its director transferred to a different department. It was then staffed with anti-feminist women associated with Phyllis Schlafly, who wanted to kill the program. Compared to the amount of actual policy victories made by the second wave feminist movement, the backlash was tremendous. More recent instances of feminist backlash include the anti-feminist movement on YouTube in the mid-2010s, where the website was overrun with feminist cringe compilations and rant videos from losers. A major component of this backlash was one that was seen with the 70s backlash. That is, women's rights being considered 1. Anti-feminist YouTubers aimed to portray third-wave feminism as superfluous. Women already had equal rights, was the claim, so continued pushing for equality was unnecessary, and actually an attack on men's rights. Like with prior backlash movements, the noise of the backlash heavily outweighed the noise of the initial feminist critique. The BuzzFeed video, Women Try Manspreading for a Week, a single, fairly goofy, pop feminist video, addressing a valid complaint of women's space not being respected in public, generated a near infinite well of angry response videos. Similar movements, such as Gamergate and Comicsgate, sought the perceived infiltration of women into male hobbies, rebuffed with widespread harassment and vitriol. In the most recent backlash to the Me Too movement, we've seen the appointment of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, the rolling back of abortion rights, sexist harassment of women like Megan Thee Stallion, who were very obviously wronged by men, and an increasing number of young men who view feminism as a net negative for society, including almost half of young Democratic men. This pervasive cultural anti-feminism, which we see emerge over and over again, serves to, as Dworkin puts it, give the huge majority of women over to the right. Because as long as the sex class system is intact, huge numbers of women will believe that the right offers them the best deal. This deal that the right offers is being a trad wife. Dworkin tells how, as opposed to the nebulous, uncertain world of career work, the right offers a simple bioessentialist role for women. She is to look after the man's house, raise his children, and he, in return, is to provide for her monetarily and protect her from harm. This idea of the importance of protecting women has been around since the start. The central conflict of The Birth of a Nation is white men joining together to protect white womanhood from the perceived sexual threat of the outside world. Dworkin writes of how contemporary women still perceived that threat. But rather than coming from a nebulous specter of black people, it was the sexual harassment they were subjected to in the workplace, in exchange for pay far inferior to that of their male counterparts. Right-wing women are not stupid. Most right-wing women are not stupid. They recognize the disadvantages they face. but choose to give in rather than resist cultural conservatism, because they fundamentally don't believe total overthrow of sexism is possible. It's not an unfair belief, given how pervasive sexism is. In lieu of fighting, right-wing women adhere to the standard because they believe it gives them the best option for protection. When you understand that, to right-wing women, conservative gender roles represent safety, their actions make more sense. Women active in the first Red Scare saw radicalism as a threat to the patriarchal protections afforded to them. Women who opposed the ERA viewed it as a threat to their safety. As Nancy MacLean puts it, these women had invested their lives in the expectations of being full-time housewives, whose husbands would support them into old age. From their perspective, the new autonomy, male and female, looked threatening. In everything she did, Phyllis Schlafly saw herself as defending women's rights. In the tradwife model, women need their husbands to support them. That's why, according to Dworkin, they see threats in things like abortion and birth control, which would free men from the consequences of sex. Women are directed towards this way of thinking by many parts of society. The most important is their parents, as the vast majority of young people share the political views of their parents. If young women are being taught to aspire to traditional housewife ideals, as they historically have been, it's no surprise they wind up pursuing them. Cultural myths, like the New Traditionalist, and more recently, the emergence of tradwife influencers on social media, direct women towards these ways of thinking. Being a tradwife sucks. As detailed in Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, it leaves women with a lack of purpose in life. More recently, we've seen the same idea with right-wing influencer Lauren Southern, who recently detailed how her traditional marriage left her suicidal and feeling like she was enslaved. Historically, many right-wing women have found a sense of purpose in conservative activism, perpetuating the system actively hurting them. It has also been noted how many prominent right-wing women are able to exercise more feminist principles in their personal lives. Phyllis Schlafly was, quite famously, a very successful career woman, in addition to having a family. So, through conservatism, women are able to accept a certain baseline of oppression, which, while not ideal, is far superior in their eyes to attempting to achieve equality in a system which they know to be rigged against them. Conclusion. I feel like right-wing women are particularly interesting to analyze, because we generally hold women to a higher standard. Women's suffrage advocates claimed that women would improve the moral character of the nation. Maternalist movements have had credence throughout history because women, in their position as mothers, are thought to have good political instincts. Dworkin writes how women are believed to have an inherent biological sense of good. This would seem to run contradictory to the existence of right-wing women, who are seen to be voting against their own best interest. And while we can analyze how, from their viewpoint, they're not voting against their own interest at all, it's also worth remembering that, to a certain extent, almost every conservative can be viewed to be voting against their own best interest, with the exception of a small number of extremely wealthy cishet white men. Practically nobody is benefited by Reaganomic tax policy, the removal of public safety nets, attacks on reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, and civil rights. But none of this prevents the existence of Black conservatives, queer conservatives, and women conservatives. All of these people perceive some degree of safety in aligning with the right, or are drawn rightwards for other reasons. The last theory for what draws women to the right I'd like to look at is bigotry. Bigotry has been interwoven throughout every movement we've looked at today. The UDC was founded on spreading white supremacist ideas. To absolutely nobody's shock, the Ku Klux Klan was racist. The DAR had segregationist policies. Elizabeth Dilling and many other anti-war mothers were notoriously anti-Semitic, and the post-war mothers movements were instrumental in the attacks on desegregation and gay rights. Today, bigotry remains one of the most effective tools to rouse not just women, but the right as a whole on any topic. Issues such as critical race theory, LGBTQ groomers, dangerous immigrants, and more dominate the conservative agenda. When women's rights are invoked by the modern conservative movement, it is most frequently used as a tool with which to attack some other minority group. The right screams women's rights in order to protest trans people's existence in public life. This is reminiscent of earlier Klan feminism, where women's rights were less a genuine end goal and more a tool to limit the rights of others. Dworkin shares this view of bigotry as a motivating factor, arguing that for many women, this bigotry is the channeling of their rage towards their husbands, fathers, and sons, which cannot be directed to them, towards another group, who it is acceptable for them to attack. So it would appear right-wing women are here to stay. That is, at least, until we fix societal sexism, bigotry in general, and the inevitable backlash any movement to do either of the first two would generate. And it's unlikely even that would fully convince all women to drop conservatism. People are individuals. Quirky individuals. Right-wing women, as we've seen, have been some of the most effective obstacles to progressive agendas throughout US history. Yet, progress has still occurred in spite of them. It's been slow, and has often included backsliding. But it's happened. No amount of right-wing women's organizing has prevented that. There's still a lot of work to be done, and a lot of improvements to be made. I believe my research demonstrates a need for improved education and for the importance of intersectionality in left-wing organizing. But progress is not dependent on fixing right-wing women. With enough time and enough effort, all of us will be dragged, kicking and screaming, into a better, more just future. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video with literally everyone you've ever met. And thank you to my lovely patrons, including my $10 patrons, Amy Gleixner, Mona Abdel Karim, and Arlen, who are the reason I could afford to buy some of these books. I'd also like to shout out ContraPoints' video, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, which put me onto Andrea Dworkin's book, and is just very good in general, as well as several of my professors, who've helped me with finding resources for this project, particularly Dr. Nakia D. Parker and Dr. Lisa Fine. This is by far the largest project I've ever done, and there's still so much I wanted to discuss, but couldn't work into the script. I'll definitely be touching on this topic again in some form in the future, so let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see. I've also included my full reading list for this video in the description, and would encourage you to purchase the books or check them out from your local library if any of the topics interested you. And also, feel free to watch every video I've ever made several times. Every me I've asked thinks they're quite good. See ya!